The record book lay open on the plantation desk, its pages yellowed with age and dampness, but it was not the lists of cotton amounts or tobacco sales that made the overseer's hand shake as he held his light closer. It was the column he had been told to keep separate, hidden from normal eyes, a list that tracked something no one wanted to talk about, yet everyone had started to see. The notes went back 7 years now, each one more worrying than the last. Blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin that got only a little darker as the children grew, all born to enslaved women across 3 parishes in Louisiana, all different mothers, all having children who looked nothing like their mothers, nothing like their listed fathers, nothing like anyone else in the living quarters, and the whispers had started. Whispers that moved from plantation to plantation along the Mississippi River, carried by traders and runaways, by house servants who heard their masters' worried talks, by midwives who had delivered these strange babies and felt their blood turn cold. Because someone was fathering these children, someone who moved unseen, someone who left no mark except the proof written in the faces of babies who should not exist. Before we go on with the story of Louisiana's darkest secret, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this, and I want to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me what state or city you are listening from. Now, let's find out what really happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. The mystery would take up 7 years, destroy families, end lives, and show a truth so planned and cruel that even tough plantation owners would struggle to understand it. But in 1837, when the first of these children was born, no one yet understood what they were seeing. What began as a single strange event would become a pattern so disturbing that it would shake the ground of Louisiana's plantation society, show the darkest corners of a system built on owning people, and reveal how power could be used with total freedom when the law itself was made to protect the person responsible. Louisiana in the late 1830s was a place of opposites and extremes. New Orleans did well as one of America's richest cities. Its port brought in sugar, cotton, and enslaved people by the thousands. The French and Spanish colonial past still shaped the culture, the buildings, and the language spoken in the streets. Creole French mixed with English, Spanish, and African languages to create a mix of speech unique to the area. The city's theaters had opera and dance. Its restaurants served food that was as good as Paris. Its ballrooms shined with lights brought from Europe. But beyond the city's lights and big homes, beyond the carefully kept gardens and the fancy fronts, the plantation economy ruled with total power. The parishes north of New Orleans, St. James, St. John the Baptist, and Ascension formed the heart of sugar country. These were not the wide cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama, where enslaved people worked somewhat alone across huge lands. Sugar growing needed different work, different timing, and different cruelty. The sugar cane had to be cut and processed within a short time before the first frost could hurt the crop. This meant that from October through December, the grinding season, every plantation became a factory running 24 hours a day. Enslaved people worked in shifts that went 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours. They cut cane in the fields under the November sun, pulled it to the sugar houses, fed it into the grinding mills, boiled the juice in huge pots, stirred the sugar, and packed it into barrels for shipping. The machines were dangerous. The mills could catch clothing, hair, or limbs, pulling workers into the grinding rollers before anyone could react. The pots of boiling sugar juice could splash, causing burns that went down to the bone. The tiredness led to accidents, to mistakes, to deaths that were written in books as simple losses of property counted against the profit of the harvest. The death rate among enslaved people on Louisiana sugar plantations was the highest in the American South. Owners knew this. They put it into their business plans. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to keep a safe pace of work. This was the world into which those strange children would be born. A world where human beings were turned into units of work, where their bodies were not their own, where the law offered them no safety and no help. The parishes were full of people compared to other plantation areas. Properties sat close together along the river. Their edges were often separated by nothing more than a line of trees or a small stream. The river was the highway, the lifeline, the connection between plantations. Steamboats moved up and down, constantly carrying goods, mail, passengers, and news. Information traveled fast here. A birth on one plantation would be known on 3 others by the next morning. A death, a sale, a punishment, all became common knowledge almost right away. This connection made the mystery even more disturbing because when the unusual births began, they did not happen alone. They formed a pattern, and patterns meant a plan. The first plantation to record such a birth was Bellamont, a mid-sized sugar business owned by the Dutchump family. They had held the land for 3 generations since the Spanish colonial time. The main house was built in the Creole style, raised on brick pillars to protect against flooding, with wide porches going around both floors. Moss-covered oak trees lined the drive from the river road. Behind the main house, the sugar works spread out, the mill building, the boiling house, the drying sheds, and the cooper, where barrels were made. Further back, beyond a line of trees, sat the quarters, 2 rows of cabins facing each other across a dirt path. Each cabin held many families, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 people in a single room. There was no privacy, no space, no comfort, just survival. The Dutchump family consisted of Monsieur Philippe Dutchump, his wife Celeste, and their 3 children. Philippe was 48 years old in 1837, a thin, nervous man who had taken the plantation from his father and managed it with constant worry. He worried about crop amounts, about sugar prices, about competition from goods brought in from Cuba, about the loans he had taken to grow his business. He worried about slave fights, about people who wanted to end slavery, and about the changing political mood that threatened the whole system his wealth relied on. His overseer, Vincent Hebert, was 32 years old and had worked at Bellamont for 6 years. Hebert was different among overseers. He could read and write well in both French and English. He kept careful records. He was known for being firm, but not needlessly cruel, for getting the most work through order rather than through fear. This made him valuable to Dutchump, who lacked the stomach for the violence that many plantation owners thought was needed. Hebert lived in a small house between the main home and the quarters, placed so he could watch both. He got up before dawn every day, made his rounds, gave out work tasks, tracked progress, and wrote everything in his books. He knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name, knew their skills, their weak points, and their family ties. This knowledge was power, and Hebert used it carefully. It was Hebert who first noticed the strange event in March of 1008, 137, and it was Hebert who would spend the next 7 years trying to understand what it meant. The child was born just before the sun came up on March 14th, 1008, 137, delivered by an older enslaved midwife named Josephine, who had brought more than 200 babies into the world over her 60-some years. Josephine had been born in Saint-Domingue before the Revolution, before it became Haiti. She had been brought to Louisiana as a young woman and had lived through everything. The change from French to American rule, many changes of owners, the deaths of her own children, and the endless hard work of the sugar harvest. She had seen every problem, every difference, every sad story that childbirth could bring. Breech births, babies born dead, mothers who bled out on the cabin floor, babies born too early to live, twins tangled together, sicknesses that turned to fever and death. She had learned to keep her face still, to show no feeling, to simply do the work and move on to the next crisis. But when she cleaned the new baby girl and saw her face in the lamplight, she felt something she rarely felt, real fear. The mother was a woman named Marie, dark-skinned, strong, 23 years old. She had been born on Bellamont, had known no other life. Her mother had died in the sugar house when Marie was 12, caught by the grinding mill, her screams cut short as the machine pulled her in. Marie had watched it happen. She had been standing 10 feet away, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but watch. After that, Marie had become quiet. She spoke only when needed, kept her eyes down, and did her work without complaint. She had been paired with a man named Thomas when she was 18, a match made by Hebert to produce children who would become plantation property. Thomas was a field hand, strong and reliable, 25 years old. They lived together in one corner of a cabin they shared with 3 other families. Marie had given birth to one child already, a boy named Jack, who was now 4 years old. He looked like his parents, dark skin, dark eyes, tightly curled hair. He was healthy, bright, and already being trained to work in the fields. This second child should have looked the same. Every expectation, every understanding of family, every look at how children looked like their parents suggested that this baby would have dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair. Instead, when Josephine wiped away the birth fluids and held the baby up to the lamp, she saw pale skin, hair so blonde it was almost white, and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Josephine wrapped the child quickly, her mind racing. She had heard stories, of course, passed down from older midwives, stories that went back generations, stories of children born looking different from their parents, explained away by distant family, by bloodlines that carried hidden traits. The old women spoke of how African peoples had mixed with Arab traders, with Portuguese sailors, with the various peoples who had moved across the continent over centuries. Sometimes those distant mixes would come back, they said, producing a child with lighter skin or different features. But this was different. This was not a slightly lighter skin tone or looser hair curl. This child looked as though she had been born to a Swedish immigrant, not to Marie. The face was completely European. The thin nose, the thin lips, the bone structure of the face. When Marie saw her daughter, she did not speak. She simply stared. Her tiredness was replaced by something else, knowing perhaps or giving up. Her hands shook as she took the baby, and Josephine saw tears begin to slide down her face. "Does she look like anyone you know?" Josephine asked quietly, a question that carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Marie's silence was answer enough. She held her daughter close, rocking slightly, and Josephine saw in her face a sadness so deep it seemed to fill the small cabin. Thomas arrived an hour later, coming from the fields where he had been working the night shift during the grinding season. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the child, his face going blank with shock. "That is not mine," he said flatly. "She is yours," Marie whispered. "She is. Look at her and tell me that is my child." "Thomas, please, who was it?" His voice was rising now. "Dangerous. Who did you be with?" "No one," Marie said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, no one. I do not understand this. I do not understand." Josephine stepped in, standing between them. "This happens sometimes," she said, though she did not believe it herself. Old blood coming through, ancestors from long ago. Thomas stared at the baby, at Marie, at Josephine. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin without another word. By midday, everyone on Bellamont knew about the birth. The news spread through the quarters like wildfire. People came to see for themselves, crowding into the cabin, staring at the impossible child. Some whispered about curses, about spirits, about punishments from God. Others were silent, their faces troubled, as though they understood something they could not or would not speak aloud. By evening, the news had reached 2 neighboring plantations carried by enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, by traders who stopped at many landings along the river, by the invisible web of talk that existed beneath the surface of plantation society. By the end of the week, Vincent Hebert had been called to the main house to explain the situation to Monsieur Duchamp. Hebert walked up the oak-lined drive with a sense of dread. He had already questioned Marie gently at first, then with more pressure. She had insisted she had been with no one but Thomas. She had sworn it, even as tears streamed down her face, even as she held her strange-looking daughter. He had questioned Thomas, who had refused to accept the child as his own, who had moved out of the cabin and asked to be moved to a different work crew. He had questioned other enslaved people who lived in the same cabin who might have seen or heard something. No one had any information, or if they did, they were not sharing it. Duchamp was pacing his study when Hebert arrived, his thin face tight with worry. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. A picture of Duchamp's father hung over the fireplace, stern and judging. "Sit down, Hebert. Tell me what happened." Hebert sat in the chair across from Duchamp's desk and laid out the facts as he knew them. The birth, the child's look, Marie's claim that she had been with no one but Thomas, the lack of any proof or words to suggest otherwise. "It is not possible," Duchamp said, starting to pace again. "Thomas is the father. It is in the records. I have the breeding records right here." He pulled out a book, flipped through pages. Marie and Thomas paired in 1832. First child born 1833. This is the second. Thomas is the father. "Yes, sir," Hebert replied carefully. "That is what the records show. But the child, I do not care what the child looks like." Duchamp interrupted, his voice sharp with worry. "There is an explanation. There must be mixed blood, perhaps. Some distant relative. These things happen. Sir, I have seen mixed blood. This is different. This child looks completely European." Duchamp stopped pacing and stared at Hebert. "What are you suggesting?" "I am not suggesting anything, sir. I am simply reporting what I have seen. Because if you are suggesting that someone, that one of us," Duchamp could not finish the sentence. The meaning was too dangerous, too shocking. "I am not suggesting anything," Hebert repeated. "I am asking what you want me to do." Dutchamp sat down heavily in his chair. He looked suddenly older, more tired. Record the birth. Note the unusual look. But the father of record remains Thomas. Is that clear? Yes, sir, and Hebert, I do not want this talked about. Not with the other overseers, not with anyone. It is a private matter, a strange event, nothing more. Yes, sir. Hebert left the main house with a troubled mind. He understood Dutchamp's position. Any suggestion that a white man had fathered a child with an enslaved woman would be scandalous, but it would not be shocking. Such things happened, though they were rarely admitted openly. The real problem was the meaning of force, of harm, because Marie insisted she had been with no one but Thomas, which meant if the child was not Thomas's, then something had happened to Marie without her say. And if that was true, if someone had hurt an enslaved woman on Dutchamp's property, it raised questions about safety, about control, about the order that was supposed to rule plantation life. It suggested that someone had access to the quarters to the women without anyone watching or punishing them. Hebert went back to his house and opened his private journal separate from the official plantation records. He wrote down everything he knew about the birth, about Marie's words, about the child's look. He dated the entry carefully, March 14th, 1837. He had no way of knowing that this note would be the first of many, that he was writing the beginning of something that would take up the next 7 years of his life. The child was named Claire. Marie tried to care for her, tried to love her, but the baby was a constant reminder of something Marie could not explain and could not escape. Thomas never accepted Claire as his daughter. He stayed away from Marie, stayed away from the cabin where she lived, stayed away from even looking at the child when their paths crossed. The other enslaved people on Bellamont were split in how they felt. Some felt sorry for Marie, knowing that something terrible had happened to her, even if she could not or would not speak of it. Others were suspicious, believing she must have been with someone, must have done something to bring this situation on herself. A few were scared, sensing that Claire's life meant something dangerous, something that threatened them all. Claire grew. She was a healthy baby, meeting all the normal steps, but her look became more striking as she aged. Her hair grew in thick and blonde. Her eyes remained that startling blue. Her skin stayed pale, burning easily in the Louisiana sun. By the time she was 6 months old, she looked like a Nordic child who had somehow ended up in the quarters of a Louisiana plantation. The difference between her look and her surroundings was jarring, disturbing, impossible to ignore. And then 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. The second birth occurred on a plantation called Riverside, 6 miles upriver from Bellamont. Riverside was larger than Bellamont, with more land under farming and a larger enslaved population. The owner was a man named Etienne Broussard, 55 years old, a second-generation Louisiana planter whose family had made their money in the sugar trade. Broussard was known for running a money-making business. He was also known for his temper, for his willingness to use violence to keep control, for his belief that enslaved people needed to be kept in a state of fear to remain useful. His overseer, a man named Gideon Frost, shared this view. Frost was 40 years old, a man from Virginia who had come to Louisiana seeking a chance. He was tall, broad, shouldered, with a face worn by sun and wind. He carried a whip at his belt and was not afraid to use it. The enslaved people at Riverside feared him, and Frost believed that fear was the base of good management. The mother was a woman named Delphine, 20 years old, who worked in the main house as a laundry woman. She had been picked for this job because of her quiet way, her speed, her ability to remain unseen. House servants had to master this skill, the ability to be there but not noticed, to move through rooms without drawing attention, to hear talks without appearing to listen. Delphine had been born on a plantation in the Natchez district and sold to Riverside when she was 15. The sale had split her from her mother and 2 younger siblings. She had never seen them again. This loss had emptied her out, left her with a kind of emptiness that she filled with work, with routine, with the small comforts she could find. A moment of rest, a full meal, the absence of pain. She had been paired with a field hand named Samuel, 22 years old, strong and quiet. They lived together in the quarters, shared a space in one of the cabins. Their relationship was polite but not close. They were 2 people thrown together by someone else's choice, making the best of a life neither had chosen. When Delphine found out she was pregnant, she felt a mix of feelings: fear, because pregnancy meant danger, meant pain, meant the chance of death, but also a small, weak hope. A child would be someone to love, someone who belonged to her, at least for a little while before the plantation claimed that child, too. The pregnancy went normally. Delphine continued her work in the laundry, carrying water, scrubbing clothes, hanging them to dry in the wet air. As her belly grew, the work became harder, but she did not complain. Complaining led to punishment. She gave birth in May of 1838, helped by the plantation midwife, a woman named Ruth. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. But finally the baby was born, a boy, healthy, crying loudly. Ruth cleaned the baby and then stopped, her hands frozen, her face going pale. "What is it?" Delphine asked, tired, reaching for her son. "What is wrong?" Ruth did not answer. She simply handed the baby to Delphine and stepped back, her face troubled. Delphine looked down at her son and felt the world tilt. The baby had blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin so pale it seemed see-through. He looked nothing like her, nothing like Samuel, nothing like anyone in her family. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't. This can't. Who is the father?" Ruth asked quietly. "Samuel. Samuel is the father." "I haven't been with anyone else. I swear it." "Then how do you explain this child?" "I can't," Delphine said, tears beginning to fall. "I can't explain it. Samuel was brought from the fields to see his son." His reaction was instant and angry. He stared at the baby, at Delphine, and his face got hard. "You have been with someone," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I haven't, Samuel. I swear. Don't lie to me." "Look at him. That is not my child. He is. He has to be. I haven't been with anyone else." "Then who did this?" "I don't know," Delphine sobbed. "I don't know." Samuel left the cabin and did not return. He asked for a move to a different work crew, to a different cabin. He never accepted the boy as his son. Gideon Frost heard about the birth within hours. He came to the quarters, pushed into the cabin where Delphine lay getting better, and stared at the baby with a mix of shock and anger. "Who is the father?" he demanded. "Samuel," Delphine whispered. "That is not Samuel's child. Look at it. I haven't been with anyone else. You are lying." "I am not. I swear on my life I am not lying." Frost questioned her for an hour, his voice growing harsher, his threats more clear. But Delphine's story never changed. She had been with no one but Samuel. She could not explain the child's look. She did not understand what had happened. Finally, Frost gave up. He reported the situation to Browsard. who reacted with fury. He accused Frost of not keeping proper control, of allowing enslaved people to move freely, of failing in his duties. Frost defended himself, insisting that he ran a tight ship, that there was no way an outsider could have accessed the quarters without being noticed. The argument went in circles. Finally, Broussard ordered the birth recorded with Samuel as the father of record, despite the clear impossibility. The matter was to be closed, not discussed, forgotten. The baby was named Jean, and like Claire before him, he was a living impossibility, a child who shouldn't exist. When news of Jean's birth reached Bellamont, Vincent Hebert felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This was not chance. This was not random nature. This was something else, something planned, something that was happening across many plantations. He pulled out his private journal and made a new entry, carefully noting the date of Jean's birth, the plantation where it happened, the mother's name, the details. He placed this note next to his notes about Claire's birth and stared at the two notes, looking for links. Both mothers had been working in or near the main houses of their plantations. Marie had been called up from the fields to help with cleaning during a time when Bellamont's regular house staff was short-handed. Delphine already worked in the house, but she had been given extra duties in the month before her pregnancy, including night work, cleaning, and preparing rooms after the family had gone to bed. Hebert felt his pulse quicken. This was a pattern, a link. It might mean nothing or it might mean everything. He began making questions carefully, quietly. He spoke to traders who moved between plantations, asking casual questions about births, about strange events, about gossip they might have heard. He questioned enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, listening to their talks, noting details, and he waited because if his thoughts were correct, if this was a pattern rather than a chance, then it would happen again. He was right. Over the next 2 years, 3 more children were born with the same impossible features. Each birth followed the same pattern. An enslaved mother with dark features, a recorded father who matched her appearance, and a child who looked nothing like either parent. The 3rd child was born at a plantation called Oakmont in November of 1838. The mother was a woman named Isabel, 25 years old, who worked in the main house as a cook's helper. The baby was a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. Isabel insisted she had been with no one but her partner, a man named Gabriel. No one believed her, but no one could prove otherwise. The 4th child was born at a plantation called St. Clair in March of 1839. The mother was a woman named Therese, 19 years old, who had been brought up from the quarters to help serve at a dinner party 2 months before her pregnancy began. The baby was a boy with the same special features. Therese's partner, a man named Antoine, refused to accept the child. The 5th child was born at a plantation called Magnolia Grove in September of 1839. The mother was a woman named Pauline, 22 years old, who worked in the laundry. She had been called to the main house to help with cleaning during a time when the regular staff was busy with other duties. Her baby was a girl, blonde and blue-eyed. Her partner, a man named Louis, left her after the birth. Vincent Hebert wrote down each birth in his private journal. He noted the dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, their work assignments. He created a map marking each place where a birth had happened. The plantations were spread across 3 parishes, but all were within a 15-mile circle along the Mississippi River. He also noted something else, something that had taken him months to piece together, a name that appeared in the background of each situation, never clearly, never obviously, but always there. Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was a doctor, 42 years old, unmarried, respected throughout the parishes. He had been born in Louisiana to a French father and a Creole mother. He had been sent to Paris to study medicine at the age of 18, had spent 8 years there, and had returned to Louisiana in 1825 to start his practice. He was known for his skill, especially in treating fevers and sicknesses that were common in the wet Louisiana climate. He was also known for his silence, his willingness to treat delicate matters without gossip, his ability to keep secrets. This made him popular among the planter families who valued privacy above almost everything else. Levine served several plantations as their main doctor, traveling between them as needed. He treated the planter families for their various sicknesses, and he also treated enslaved people when their value as property justified the cost. A skilled worker with a broken bone, a pregnant woman whose child represented future property, a house servant whose training made them valuable. These were worth the cost of medical care. Levine was also known for his special look. He was tall and thin with pale blonde hair that he wore longer than was stylish and striking blue eyes that seemed to see through people. He dressed well, but not too flashy, in dark suits that showed off his pale coloring. He moved with a kind of careful grace, speaking softly, never raising his voice, always keeping perfect control. Hebert had met Levine several times over the years. The doctor had been called to Bellamont to treat Madame Duchamp for a fever, to set a broken arm for a field hand who had been hurt during harvest, to attend to various small sicknesses. Hebert had found him professional, able, and oddly cold. There was something about Levine that made Hebert uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite say what it was. Now, looking over his notes, Hebert saw the pattern. Levine had been present at or near each plantation during the key time periods before the pregnancies began. He had attended a social party at Bellamont in December of 1836, 3 months before Marie got pregnant. He had been called to Riverside to treat Madame Broussard for a breathing sickness in February of 1838, 3 months before Delphine got pregnant. He had delivered a baby for the owner's wife at Oakmont in August of 1838, 3 months before Isabel got pregnant. He had examined an injured worker at St. Clair in December of 1838, 3 months before Therese got pregnant. He had attended a dinner party at Magnolia Grove in June of 1839, 3 months before Pauline got pregnant. Always there, always in the background, always with access. Hebert's hands shook as he made these links. He reviewed his notes again and again, checking dates, matching visits, looking for any mistake in his thinking, but the pattern held. It was too precise to be chance, but having a suspicion and proving it were entirely different matters. Hebert had no direct proof, no witnesses, no confession. He had only a pattern, a series of chances that seemed too precise to be accidental. He needed to speak to the women. If Levine was responsible, then the women would know. They might not be able to speak openly, might not be willing to accuse a white man, especially a respected doctor, but they would know. Hebert started with Marie since she was on his own plantation. He found her in the fields one afternoon working with a hoe, her daughter Claire tied to her back in a cloth sling. Claire was now 2 years old, her blonde hair bright in the sun. Marie, Hebert said quietly, walking up to her. "I need to speak with you." Marie looked up, her face guarded. "Yes, sir, about Claire, about her father." Marie's face closed completely. "Thomas is her father, sir. That is what the records say." "Marie, I know that is not true. And I think you know it too. I don't know what you mean, sir. I think someone hurt you, someone you couldn't refuse, someone who had power over you." Marie was silent for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Even if that were true, sir, what difference would it make? I am property. Property can't be hurt. Property can't refuse. Property has no rights. Marie, I have nothing more to say, sir. Thomas is Claire's father. That is what the records show." She turned back to her work, and Hebert knew he would get nothing more from her. The wall she had built around this secret was strong. He tried with the other women, traveling to the other plantations on various reasons, finding chances to speak with Delphine, with Isabelle, with Therese, with Pauline. Each talk went the same way. The women insisted they had been with no one but their listed partners. They had nothing more to say. The wall was always there, strong. Hebert understood. These women had no legal standing, no rights, no help. If they accused a white man, especially a respected doctor, they would not be believed. They would be punished for lying, for making trouble, for threatening the social order. Their children might be sold away. Their lives might become even more unbearable than they already were. Silence was their only protection, however poor. Hebert decided he needed to take his findings to someone with more power, someone who might actually be able to act on the information. He chose Judge Armand Thibaudaux, a respected figure in St. James Parish. Thibaudaux was 60 years old, a lawyer who had been put on the bench 15 years earlier. He was known for his fairness within the limits of the system, for his willingness to address difficult matters, for his smarts and his honesty. Hebert asked for a meeting, and Thibaudaux agreed to see him. They met in Thibaudaux's office in the parish courthouse, a wet afternoon in July 1840. The office was lined with law books, and papers covered every surface. Thibaudaux sat behind his desk, a large man with gray hair and sharp eyes. Hebert laid out his proof carefully. He showed Thibaudaux his map with the plantations marked. He showed him his timeline with the dates of the births and the dates of Levine's visits. He explained the pattern, the link, the impossibility of chance. Thibaudaux listened in silence, his face growing darker as he spoke. When Hebert finished, Thibaudaux sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is a serious claim," Thibaudaux said finally. "I know, sir. That is why I have brought it to you. Do you have any direct proof, any words from the women?" "No, sir. They won't speak or can't speak. I have tried." Thibaudaux stood and walked to his window, looking out at the street below. The courthouse was in the center of the parish seat, a small town that served the nearby plantations. The street was busy with afternoon traffic, wagons, horses, people going about their business. "You understand what you are suggesting," Thibaudaux said, his back still to Hebert. "Dr. Levine is a respected member of this community. His family has been here for generations. His father was a well-known merchant. His mother came from one of the old Creole families. To accuse him of this without solid proof would be crushing. It would destroy his name, his practice, his life. I understand, sir, but the children exist. The pattern exists. 5 children in 2 years, all with the same impossible features. All born to mothers who had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception. Patterns can be chance. 5 times, sir, across 5 plantations, all within 2 years and all connected to one man." Thibaudaux turned back to face Hebert. "Even if you are right, even if Dr. Levine is responsible. What law has he broken? You said yourself that the women won't speak. Without their words, there is no case. And even with their words, he trailed off, and Hebert understood what he wasn't saying. Even with words, enslaved women had no legal standing. Their word would not be taken over that of a white man, especially a respected doctor. The law did not recognize what had been done to them as a crime. So there is nothing to be done? Hebert asked, hearing the bitterness in his own voice. I didn't say that, Thibodeaux replied. I will make inquiries quietly. I will speak to some of the plantation owners, ask questions, see what I can learn. But I want you to stop your investigation. If word of this spreads, if claims start flying without proof, it will cause panic and damage that we may not be able to stop. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Go back to Bellamont. Say nothing to anyone. Let me handle this. Hebert left the courthouse with a mix of relief and frustration. He had done what he could. The matter was now in official hands, but he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would come of it, that the truth would be buried under the weight of name and social standing. He was right. Judge Thibodeaux did make inquiries, but they were so quiet as to be nearly invisible. He spoke to 3 of the plantation owners privately in carefully arranged meetings that left no public record. He asked vague questions about Dr. Levine's visits, about strange events, about the births of the distinct-looking children. The answers were all defensive. The plantation owners saw the questions as threats to their property values, their names, their social standing. They insisted there was nothing unusual, nothing that required looking into. The children were strange events, genetic quirks, nothing more. Etienne Broussard, the owner of Riverside, was particularly angry. He met with Thibodeaux in his study, a room dominated by a massive desk and pictures of his ancestors. Are you suggesting that I don't know what happens on my own property? Broussard demanded, his face red with anger, that I can't control my own people. This is insulting, Armand, deeply insulting. I am not suggesting anything of the kind, Thibodeaux replied calmly. I am simply following up on some concerns that have been brought to my attention. Concerns? What concerns? That some babies were born with light skin. That happens sometimes. Mixed blood, distant families. It is not unusual. 5 babies in 2 years, Etienne, all on different plantations, all with the same special features. So that is chance, nothing more, and all the mothers had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception. Broussard's face went from red to pale. What are you saying? I am not saying anything. I am stating a fact. Dr. Levine is a respected doctor. He has treated my family for years. He is perfect. I am sure he is. But the pattern, there is no pattern. Broussard interrupted. There are chances, and I won't have you spreading rumors that could hurt a good man's name or mine. Do you understand? Thibodeaux understood. He understood that Broussard was more concerned about scandal than about truth, more worried about property values than about justice. He understood that pushing further would make enemies of powerful men, would damage his own position, would do nothing. The other plantation owners gave similar answers. They were defensive, angry, unwilling to consider that something wrong might have happened on their properties. To admit that would be to admit failure of control, failure of watching, failure of the system itself. Within 2 weeks, Thibodeaux sent word to Hebert that the investigation was closed. There was not enough proof to go on. The matter was to be dropped. Hebert received the news with bitter resignation. He had expected it, but the confirmation still hurt. He filed his notes away, locked them in his desk, and tried to return to his normal duties, but the births did not stop. In November 1840, another child was born at a plantation called Sweetwater. 8 miles south of Bellamont. The plantation was smaller than most, specializing in indigo rather than sugar. The owner was a widow named Madame Hebert, no relation to Vincent, who ran the operation with the help of her son. The mother was a woman named Cecile, 24 years old, who worked in the sugar house during grinding season and in the fields the rest of the year. The baby was a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Cecile's partner, a man named Joseph, refused to accept the child. Dr. Levine had been called to Sweetwater 3 months earlier to treat Madame Hebert's son for a fever. He had stayed for 2 days, sleeping in a guest room, taking his meals with the family. In March 1841, another birth at Riverside. The mother was a different woman this time, a field hand named Lisette, 21 years old. The baby was a girl with the same special features. Lisette's partner, a man named Michel, left her after the birth. Dr. Levine had attended a social gathering at Riverside in December of 1840. In August 1841, another birth at Oakmont. The mother was a woman named Margaret, 23 years old, who worked in the main house. The baby was a boy. Margaret's partner, a man named Henry, refused to speak to her after the birth. Dr. Levine had been called to Oakmont to treat an injured field hand in May of 1841. In January 1842, another birth at a new plantation, Cypress Point, 10 miles north of Bellamont. The mother was a woman named Adele, 20 years old. The baby was a girl. Adele's partner, a man named Francois, requested a transfer to a different plantation. Dr. Levine had attended a dinner party at Cypress Point in October of 1841. The pattern continued, non-stop and undeniable. Vincent Hebert wrote down each birth in his private journal. Even though he had been told to stop his investigation, he couldn't let it go. The pattern was too clear, too planned. 9 children now, all with the same impossible features, all connected to Dr. Levine, and with each new birth, the whispers grew louder. The enslaved community knew something was wrong. They couldn't speak openly, couldn't accuse, couldn't demand justice, but they knew, and they began to protect themselves. Women started refusing tasks to the main houses. They claimed illness, injury, any excuse to avoid being called up from the quarters. When pushed, they became angry, resistant, unhelpful. Overseers noticed the resistance and responded with punishment. Women were whipped for refusing work tasks, for claiming false illness, for fighting back. But the resistance continued. The women seemed willing to accept punishment rather than risk being called to the main houses. This created problems for the plantation operations. House servants were needed for the smooth running of the main houses. Laundry had to be done, meals had to be prepared, rooms had to be cleaned. When women refused these tasks, the work fell to others, creating anger and problems. The tension on the plantations became clear. Work output dropped. Small acts of rebellion increased. Tools broken. Work slowed. Minor acts of sabotage that couldn't be directly traced, but added up to big problems. The plantation owners blamed their overseers for losing control. The overseers blamed the enslaved workers for being lazy and rebellious. No one wanted to admit the real cause of the unrest except Vincent Hebert. He saw what was happening, understood the fear that drove it. The women were protecting themselves the only way they could through resistance and refusal, even at the cost of punishment, and he made a decision that would change everything. He began writing down the births again, but this time he didn't keep the information to himself. He shared it carefully and selectively with other overseers, with traders, with anyone who might listen. He created copies of his map, his timeline, his proof connecting Dr. Levine to each event. He knew it was dangerous. He knew he was risking his job, possibly his life, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. The pattern was too clear, the injustice too great, the suffering too deep. The information spread slowly at first, then faster. Overseers talked to each other, comparing notes, sharing stories. Traders carried the information from plantation to plantation, from parish to parish. The whispers became talks. The talks became discussions. By the summer of 1842, the story was known throughout the 3 parishes. It was discussed in quiet talks in plantation offices, in letters between plantation owners, in the careful language of people who understood they were approaching something explosive. The plantation owners tried to hide the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal was becoming public knowledge, and finally, inevitably, the story reached Dr. Marcus Levine himself. Levine's reaction was not what anyone expected. He didn't deny the claims. He didn't run. He didn't show any sign of shame or fear. Instead, he called a meeting in September 1842. He sent formal invites to the owners of all the affected plantations, asking them to gather at his home on a Thursday evening. He also invited Judge Thibodeaux, several other important citizens, and surprisingly Vincent Hebert. The invites were polite but firm. Levine wrote that he understood there had been questions about certain matters, and he wished to address these questions directly and fully. He asked for the courtesy of a hearing before any further action was taken. The plantation owners were caught off guard. The invite itself was unusual, almost unheard of, but they agreed to attend, curious about what Levine might say, how he might defend himself. Hebert received his invite with a sense of dread. He didn't know what Levine was planning, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening, September 15th, 1842. The air was thick with humidity and the threat of rain. 15 men gathered at Levine's home, a modest but well-kept house on the edge of the parish seat. The house was built in the American style rather than Creole, with a balanced front and a central hallway. Levine greeted each guest personally as they arrived, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role of good host. He was dressed perfectly in a dark suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes clear and steady. He showed no sign of nervousness or concern. When all the guests had arrived, Levine led them to his parlor, a room filled with comfortable chairs arranged in a half-circle. A table held bottles of whiskey and brandy, glasses, cigars. Levine invited the men to help themselves, to make themselves comfortable. The feeling was strange. It felt like a social party, not a fight. The men sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting to hear what the doctor had to say. Levine stood before them, calm and composed. He held a glass of brandy in one hand, and he took a small sip before beginning to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I understand there have been questions about certain births that have occurred over the past several years, questions about the appearance of these children, about their parents, about my possible part in it." The room was absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on Levine. "I want to address these questions directly and honestly," Levine continued. "I believe that clarity is better than rumor, that truth is better than guessing. So let me be clear. Yes, I am the father of these children, all of them." The silence broke into chaos. Men shouted, stood, demanded explanations. Judge Thibodeaux called for order, his voice barely heard over the noise. Broussard was on his feet. his face purple with rage. Dutchamp looked as though he might faint. Levine waited, patient, sipping his brandy until the room quieted again. It took several minutes. "I understand your shock," Levine said when he could be heard again. "But before you judge me, I ask that you hear my explanation. What I have done with purpose and with what I believe to be sound reasoning." "Sound reasoning," Broussard shouted. "You have violated." "I have conducted an experiment," Levine interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "A scientific experiment that I believe has huge meanings for our understanding of human heredity and racial traits." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Confused, horrified, Levine walked to a desk in the corner of the room and picked up a leather-bound journal. He held it up so everyone could see. "For the past 7 years," he said, "I have been studying the question of racial inheritance. Specifically, I wanted to understand whether the physical traits we connect with race are fixed or whether they can be changed through selective breeding." He opened the journal, showing pages filled with notes, drawings, measurements, observations. The handwriting was neat and precise, the work of someone who took pride in keeping records. "I thought," Levine continued, "that by introducing European genetic material into the African population, I could produce children that showed European features. The children born over these years have proven my idea. Regardless of the mother's look, my genetic part has ruled, producing children with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin." Vincent Hebert felt physically ill. Around him, other men showed similar reactions. Pale faces, tight jaws, hands gripping chair arms. The casual way Levine spoke about human beings, about women, about children, was more disturbing than any rage or excuse would have been. "You are talking about human beings," Thibodeaux said, his voice shaking. "Not animals, not test subjects. Human beings, am I?" Levine asked, turning to face the judge. His face was genuinely curious, as though this were an interesting, deep question. "The law of this state says otherwise, Judge Thibodeaux." "The law says these women are property. The law says their children are property. I have broken no rule, broken no law. I have simply used available resources to chase scientific knowledge." "You have committed rape," Hebert said, the word hanging in the air like poison, "multiple times against women who had no ability to refuse you, no ability to protect themselves." Levine turned to him, his face unchanged. "Rape is a crime committed against persons, Mr. Hebert. These women are not legally persons. They are property. I no more committed rape than a farmer commits rape when he breeds his cattle. The law is quite clear on this point." The logic was monstrous, but it was also legally sound. Louisiana law in 1842 did not recognize enslaved people as having the legal standing to be victims of rape. They were property, and property could not be raped. The law protected property owners from theft or damage to their property, but it did not protect the property itself from the actions of others. Several of the plantation owners looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up to challenge Levine's reasoning, because to do so would be to challenge the entire legal and social structure that supported their way of life. If enslaved people were persons with rights, then the entire system of slavery became impossible. "Why?" Dutchamp asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do this? What did you hope to gain?" "Knowledge," Levine replied simply, "understanding. I wanted to prove that racial traits are not fixed, that they can be changed through selective breeding. This has meanings for everything, for slavery, for colonization, for the future of human society. He walked back to the center of the room, his journal still in his hand. "Consider the possibilities," he said, his voice taking on an almost preaching quality. "If we can change racial traits through selective breeding, we can reshape entire populations. We can create workers perfectly suited to specific climates and tasks. We can remove bad traits and enhance good ones. We can build the future of humanity itself." "You are insane," someone whispered. "I am a scientist," Levine corrected. "And my experiment has been successful. The children exist. The proof is undeniable. I have proven that European traits rule African traits in mixed children. This is valuable knowledge, gentlemen. Knowledge that could be used to push forward our understanding of human biology, of heredity, of the very nature of race itself." Judge Thibodeau stood, his face red with anger and something else, disgust perhaps, or horror at what he was hearing. "Dr. Levine," he said, his voice hard, "regardless of the legal details, what you have done is very wrong. You have caused huge suffering to women who had no ability to refuse you. You have destroyed families. You have upset multiple plantations. You have created a scandal that will damage this entire region." "I have created knowledge," Levine replied calmly. "What you do with that knowledge is your concern, not mine. I have documented everything in this journal and in others, my methods, my observations, my conclusions. This information will be valuable to future scientists, to future generations. You will leave this parish," Thibodeau said. "You will stop your practice here, sell your property, and go. If you refuse, I will find a way to bring charges. Legal details be damned. I will make your life here impossible." Levine smiled slightly, and the smile was somehow more disturbing than anything else he had said. "I have already made plans to leave, Judge Thibodeau. My work here is complete. I have gathered enough data. I am moving to Texas, where I plan to continue my research on a larger scale. The frontier offers chances that are not available in more settled regions." "Get out," Broussard said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get out of this parish. Get out of Louisiana, and if I ever see you again, I will kill you myself." Levine set down his brandy glass and nodded slightly as though accepting a compliment. "I will be gone within the week," he said. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I thought it important that you understand the truth of what has occurred. Rumors and guessing serve no one." The meeting dissolved into angry arguments, threats, and blame. But in the end, there was nothing anyone could do. Levine had broken no law. He could not be charged, could not be punished through official channels. The system that should have protected the women he had hurt had instead protected him. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. His house was sold to a merchant from New Orleans. His practice was moved to another doctor. His furniture, his books, his personal things were packed and shipped. He vanished into the growing American frontier, taking his journals, his data, and his monstrous certainty with him. The fallout of Levine's revelation spread through the parishes like a fever. The plantation owners tried to hide the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal became common knowledge discussed in New Orleans living rooms, in riverboat bars, in the careful letters that passed between planter families across Louisiana and beyond. The children remained, of course, 13 of them by the time Levine left, ranging in age from newborn to 5 years old. They grew up in the quarters, marked by their look, living proof of what had been done to their mothers. The mothers struggled with their children in different ways. Some, like Marie, tried to love these children despite everything. Marie held Claire close, sang to her, protected her as best she could. but there was always a distance, a wall that Marie couldn't quite break through. Every time she looked at Claire, she saw the violation, the helplessness, the night that had changed everything. Others couldn't bear to look at their children. Delphine at Riverside became quiet and silent after Jean's birth. She cared for him mechanically, feeding him, keeping him clean, but showing no affection. When Jean reached for her, she would turn away. When he cried, she would hand him to another woman to comfort. Children sensed this rejection. Even as babies, they grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were unwanted, knowing their very existence caused pain. The fathers, the men who had been listed as fathers, the men who had been partners to these women, reacted with anger and leaving. Thomas never accepted Claire. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. Eventually, he requested a transfer to another plantation, and Dutchamp granted it, glad to be rid of a source of tension. Samuel at Riverside did the same. So did Gabriel, Antoine, Louis, Joseph, Michel, Henry, Francois, and the others. These men had been paired with these women by their owners, forced into relationships they hadn't chosen. But they had made lives together, found small comforts in companionship. The births destroyed those weak connections. The women were left alone, raising children who looked nothing like them, children who were constant reminders of force and lack of power. The enslaved community was divided in its response. Some people felt sorry for the mothers, understanding that something terrible had happened to them. They helped when they could, watching the strange-looking children, sharing food, offering what comfort was possible. Others were suspicious or hostile. They believed the mothers must have done something to bring this on themselves, must have been willing participants. They whispered about the women, spread rumors, ignored them. The children grew up in this feeling of suspicion and division. They were neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, existing in a middle ground within the quarters. As they got older, their look became even more striking. By the time Claire was 5 years old, she looked like a Swedish child who had somehow ended up on a Louisiana plantation. Her hair was long and blonde, her eyes that startling blue, her skin pale and prone to burning. She stood out among the other children like a candle in darkness. The same was true for all of Levine's children. They were beautiful in a standard European sense, and this beauty made them valuable in a specific way. As they grew older, some were sold to traders who specialized in what were nicely called fancy girls, enslaved women with light skin who were sold for bad purposes. The boys were sometimes kept as house servants, their appearance making them suitable for positions where they would be seen by visitors. This was another layer of horror. Levine's experiment had not only hurt the mothers, but had also created children who would be used because of their appearance, because of the very features that marked them as different. Vincent Hebert continued as overseer at Bellamont for 3 more years after Levine's leaving, but he found it harder and harder to continue in his job. Every day he saw Claire growing up, saw Marie's pain, saw the proof of a crime that had no legal name and no possibility of justice. In 1845, he resigned his job and moved to New Orleans. He found work as a clerk in a shipping office, a job that paid less but allowed him to sleep at night. He took his journals with him, the careful notes of everything that had happened. Years later, in 1867, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been ended, Hebert gave his journals to a historical society. He wrote a cover letter explaining what the papers contained, why he had kept them, what they meant. These records, he wrote, document a crime that was not legally a crime. a violation that was not legally a violation, suffering that was not legally suffering. They show how a system designed to treat human beings as property created conditions where the most monstrous acts could be committed without consequence. I kept these records because I believed that someday someone would want to know the truth, that someday the truth would matter. The journals were filed away in an archive, rarely looked at, a testament to a crime that was never officially admitted. Judge Thibodeaux tried to pursue legal action against Levine, but every lawyer he asked gave him the same answer. There was no case, no law had been broken, the women had no legal standing to bring charges. The plantation owners had no grounds for complaint since their property had not been damaged in any legally recognized way. Thibodeaux spent months researching, looking for any legal way that might allow charges. He checked law books, wrote to colleagues in other states, sought advice from legal experts, but the answer was always the same. Under Louisiana law in 1842, what Levine had done was not a crime. This realization haunted Thibodeaux for the rest of his life. He had spent his career believing in the law, believing that the legal system, however imperfect, served justice. Levine's case forced him to face the truth, that the law itself could be unjust, that a legal system built on the idea that some human beings were property could never deliver justice to those people. Thibodeaux retired from the bench in 1850, citing health reasons. He died in 1855, and those who knew him said he had never been the same after the Levine affair. As for Dr. Marcus Levine, he did move to Texas, where he started a new medical practice in a growing frontier town. He continued his research for at least another decade, according to broken records that survived. There are hints in letters, in birth records, in the memories of people who lived in that town that the pattern continued. More children with impossible features, more women who couldn't speak of what had happened to them. Levine died in 1856, seemingly of natural causes. He was 56 years old. His executor, a lawyer who had been handling his affairs, found his journals among his things. The lawyer read them, was horrified by their contents, and made the decision to destroy them. He burned every journal, every note, every piece of documentation related to Levine's experiments. Some knowledge, the lawyer wrote in his own diary, is too dangerous to keep. Some truths are too monstrous to pass on to future generations. I have destroyed Dr. Levine's work, not to protect his name, but to protect humanity from the ideas contained in those pages. But the children remained. The proof of Levine's experiments lived on in the faces of 13 children in Louisiana and an unknown number in Texas. These children grew up, had children of their own, passed on the genes that Levine had introduced into their families. When the Civil War came and slavery ended, these children, now adults, faced a different kind of challenge. They were too white, looking to be easily accepted in black communities, too black by law and heritage to be accepted in white society. They existed in a middle ground belonging nowhere, their very existence a reminder of the horrors that had created them. Some tried to pass as white, leaving their families and their histories behind, creating new identities in new places. This was possible for those with the lightest skin, the most European features. They disappeared into white society, married white spouses, raised children who never knew their true heritage. Others remained in black communities, accepting their outsider status, building lives despite the suspicion and questions that followed them. They married, had children, created families. Sometimes their children looked like them, blonde, blue-eyed, pale. Sometimes the African features came back, producing children who looked more like their grandmothers than their parents. The genetic legacy of Levine's experiments continued for generations. Even today, more than 180 years later, there are families in Louisiana who occasionally produce a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child despite having mostly African ancestry. Most don't know the full story of their heritage. The details were buried, forgotten, or deliberately erased. But the story remains documented in those old ledgers, in Hebert's careful notes, in the birth records that show an impossible pattern, a reminder that the horrors of slavery were not just about physical cruelty or money use. They were also about the complete dehumanization of human beings, the reduction of people to property, to test subjects, to things that could be used and hurt without consequence. Louisiana kept discovering those babies, kept recording their births, kept noting the impossible pattern. 13 children in 7 years, all with blonde hair and blue eyes, all born to enslaved women with dark features, all fathered by one man who saw them not as human beings, but as data points in an experiment. The system that should have protected their mothers, that should have punished their father, that should have recognized the crime for what it was, failed completely, because in 1842, Louisiana, enslaved women were not persons. They were property, and property could not be raped, could not be hurt, could not demand justice. That was the real horror, not the births themselves, but the legal and social structure that made them possible and then protected the man responsible. The horror was in the system that allowed a respected doctor to conduct experiments on human beings without their consent, to violate women who had no legal help to create children who would grow up marked by their origins, and to walk away without facing any consequences. The children were proof, but proof of what? Of a crime that had no name, no legal recognition, no possibility of charges. They were living proof that the system was working exactly as designed to protect the powerful and deny humanity to the powerless. Vincent Hebert understood this. In his final journal entry written in 1867, before he gave his records to the Historical Society, he wrote, "I have spent 25 years trying to understand what happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. I have documented the births, traced the pattern, identified the person responsible, presented the proof to those with the power to act, and I have learned that sometimes the greatest crimes are those that are perfectly legal. That sometimes the most deep injustice is built into the very structure of the law itself. Dr. Levine committed no crime under Louisiana law. He broke no rule. He broke no law. He simply used the system as it was designed to be used, treating human beings as property, as resources, as experimental subjects. The law protected him because the law was written to protect men like him. The real crime was not what Dr. Levine did to those women, though that was monstrous enough. The real crime was the system that made it possible, the law that denied those women any legal standing, any rights, any help. The real crime was slavery itself. I kept these records because I believed that someday the truth would matter, that someday people would want to know what happened, would want to understand how such things were possible. I kept them